Welcome back to the second session. We have two speakers in this session. We have Master Jorge Heine and we have Lalitha Kumaramangalam. Now I'm going to introduce them. Although they are all in the brochure. But Master Jorge Heine is a research professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies, Interim Director of the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future at Boston University. He's been Chile's ambassador to China, to India, and to South Africa, as well as the cabinet minister in the Chilean government. A past vice president of the International Political Science Association, he was CG Professor of Global Governance at Wilfrid Laurier University and has held visiting appointments at the universities of Constance, Oxford, Paris, and Singapore. He's published 17 books. So evidently he is a very distinguished intellectual, and we are very glad that he's come all the way to be with us. He's also come from Boston, Professor. And the second speaker is Lalitha Kumaramangalam. She is the daughter, as I said, of my dear friend Mohan Kumaramangalam, and she studied BA from St. Stephen's College in Delhi University, did her MBA from Madras University, specializing in marketing and personnel. Yes. What on earth are you doing in marketing and personnel? A single mother, a cancer survivor, yes. Cancer survivor, champion of equal opportunity and inclusion. She has worked with diverse populations like sex workers, LGBTQ1+, on health, empowerment and development. Her multifaceted personality is enhanced by diverse family heritage, knowledge of Tamil, Bengali, Hindi, and her mother was Bengali, his father was Tamil, Hindi and English. A nature enthusiast, animal lover.
Yes.
She believes in sustainable living. That's very good. A politician, trainer, motivator, TEDx speaker. She's run her own NGO, Prakriti, for over 5 decades. And she had worked with a lot of PSOs and so on. She was chairperson of the National Commission for Women, which is a very important post, as you know. She has steered several laws like the surrogacy law, the Triple Talaq Bill, amendments in the maternity benefits law, so on and so. She continues to serve on the boards of several NGOs and to work at the grassroots to empower disadvantaged communities. So, Professor Heine, this is yours. Would you like to speak from there?
Yes, I'll speak.
All professors like to speak standing up.
That's right.
You know, just one little thing. Our Indian tradition, Professor, just let me tell you, our ancient tradition was never to stand up and speak. I mean, the man sat and stood. Upanishads को बोलते थे, खड़े होके थोड़ी बोलते थे. And this is a Western tradition to speak while you're standing. Began with Socrates. They not only spoke, he walked up and down the colonnade. That's why they became known as the peripatetic philosophers, because they walked up and down. So at least he's not walking, he's standing. Go ahead.
That's right. Well, my mother passed away a long time. She gave me a piece of advice that I have followed. And the piece of advice was, my dear son, at any social function, never sit down. Good morning. In the first place, let me thank the organizers of this conference, Dr. Karan Singh, whom I met 20 years ago in this great city, was impressed then by his brilliance and intellect, and I'm impressed now about his sharpness and his brilliance. He mentioned something about the influence that Mahatma Gandhi had in the United States. Well, let me tell you, I teach at Boston University. Martin Luther King got his doctorate in theology at Boston University. And when he came to visit India, he said a phrase that I always quote to my students. Martin Luther King said, "When I visit countries around the world. I go there as a tourist. But when I come to India, I do so as a pilgrim. And I thought that shows very well the influence that Gandhi had on him and the non-violent approach to social struggle and to politics. And I was ambassador to South Africa in the 1990s. I was actually the first ambassador to present credentials to Nelson Mandela and had a chance to interact with him quite a bit. And he, of course, was also extremely influenced by Mahatma Gandhi and his philosophy. So, Indian philosophy reaches very much across the world. I would like to thank Mr. Shrivastava, who was there, for all his support, and of course Anindita Balslev for the invitation to come to this meeting. It is great to be back in India. I spent 4 wonderful years here from 2003 to 2007, including many activities here at this center. For 1 year I ran a monthly seminar for a whole year with my colleagues from the Latin American group. And we had different themes every month. And I was mentioning to Mr. Shrivastava that I've been organizing conferences and seminars and workshops for the past 45 years. My main concern is always, will there be enough of an audience? The most difficult thing in the world is to get somebody to go someplace. And the good thing about the IIC is that not only does it provide a venue, it also has its own audience, which is a great advantage for those who organize events. And I stepped in here this morning, 10 to 10, and Anindita said to me, "We are not going to have anybody because of traffic restrictions. We will have to speak to ourselves." And here we have, a full house. So, delighted to be here. The Chilean embassy used to be at Jorge, very close from here. So I would often come here to book launches and events and stop by at Lodi Gardens. So it's really great to be back. But let me now zero in on the subject of this meeting. My colleagues in Boston, where I live, when I came here, asked me, "Well, are you going to stay for the G20? And I would love to stay, but classes start on Tuesday, and even I cannot be in 2 places at the same time. So I'm leaving tomorrow evening. But the G20 being held here, the BRICS summit that was recently held in Johannesburg, speaks to the central role that India is playing in today's world, the degree to which India, in fact, is the leader of the Global South, and New Delhi, the capital of the Global South. And the question at hand that Dr. Balslev shared with me in her book, Cross-Cultural Conversations, which is a real tour de force of some of the most significant philosophical issues of our time. And chapter 3 in that book on the creative tension between nationalism and globalism is what I want to address this morning. Now, a caveat, I am not a philosopher. I am something much more modest, merely a political scientist who tries to figure out what is happening in the world. We are much more down to earth, much more empirically oriented, as it were. We don't lead with a spiritual and eternity as philosophers do. So I feel a bit like an imposter here. But I'm glad to be here and delighted to share my thoughts on them, even if they are not fully philosophical. So, first of all, let me commend Dr. Balslev for putting a finger on such a key subject in world affairs. The tension between nationalism and globalism, between particularism and universalism, is of course very much at the heart of the challenges faced by the international system today. And much depends on how we resolve this tension, on whether we will be able, in fact, to continue to go on as humanity, as a species. And she quite rightly underscores that current arrangements are, not exactly fit for purpose anymore. that the basic units of the international system are not responding to the enormous challenges that we face. And here a distinction has to be made, and we were talking about it earlier over tea, and that is between globalism and globalization. Globalization is a process by which we have an increased flow of goods, services, people, capital, cultural products across the world, across borders. So that's a process. And globalism, in turn, is a Weltanschauung, an ideology, a look at the world that looks at the world as a whole, in toto, as opposed to just as any of its small parts. So the question is, how do we move from nationalism to globalism? And obviously one could say, well, why do we need to do that? And the reason is very simple. The world faces some major global challenges that, as Dr. Singh said, cannot be solved by individual nation states. They need international cooperation, otherwise they will not be solved. And we know only too well the extraordinary incapacity of current arrangements to respond to global challenges. And the most recent, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic, of which we are not fully out yet. And this is the worst pandemic in a century. You would think that the international community would have been able to respond to this by increasing communication, increasing cooperation, looking for ways of solving this problem collectively. The virus doesn't know any borders. It doesn't ask for visas. It is all over the place. Yet that is not what happened. I would argue very strongly that the global pandemic showed a tremendous failure of the international system and of international organizations to respond to it. Basically, it was an everyone for himself response to it, which obviously, of course, doesn't work. If you don't, deal with the virus globally, it will continue to fester as it is still around. And what we saw, particularly in some of the leading Western countries, was the emergence of something called, which is most extraordinary, and this is a term that I had not heard, and that only came about in 2021, vaccine nationalism. Now, what does that mean? Well, I will tell you what it means. It means that in early 2021, when a number of countries, including the United States, a number of European countries, had in fact developed a vaccine to deal with this tremendous pandemic. In countries, in my part of the world, in Latin America, said, look, we don't want charity. Sell us vaccines. And the response was, no, by no means. We are not selling you any vaccines. Until the last European is vaccinated, no vaccine will leave the European continent. Now, this was at a time when in Germany, in Switzerland, in Austria, many people were not willing to be vaccinated. So you have this extraordinary situation of countries hoarding vaccines for many people who didn't want to be vaccinated, and yet unwilling to sell them to the rest of the world, where hundreds of thousands, if not millions, were dying as a result of it. Now, if that doesn't show a tremendous failure of current arrangements, of the way the world works, I don't know what does. But let us step back for a moment and examine where globalization, that is the process by which the flow of large amounts of goods, services, capital, and people traverse international boundaries, is. The current wave of globalization, which started circa 1980 with the advent of the personal computer and the coming on stream of CNN, the first worldwide 24-hour news channel, and received an additional impetus with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the establishment of the WTO in 1994, has largely been, I would argue, beneficial to humankind. in this period, in the past 30 years, 40 years, we have seen the dramatic reduction in poverty around the world, especially in China and in India, the achievement of the first Millennium Development Goals of the UN, and a general improvement in the conditions of life of humankind. People today live better, they live longer, and they can expect more from life than they did half a century ago. And this, of course, is very much a good thing. But here comes the great paradox, and why basically the current phase of globalization has come to an end, and we have moved from slowbalization, which was the slowing down of globalization, to, in some ways, outright deglobalization, in which there are fewer goods, services, and capital that is flowing around the world. A reduction of these flows with negative consequences for economic growth and development. And what we're seeing in China today with its economic troubles show what the effects of this deglobalization process, the imposition of tariffs, of protectionism around the world can affect. Now, what is interesting is that the conventional wisdom in the 80s and 90s was that globalization would be a great boon for the West, for Western transnational companies. They would increase their profits, and once again, the peoples of what was then called the Third World, developing nations, would be left holding the bag. Well, you know, that is not necessarily played out that way. I remember some of you were not even born at the time, but in 1999, there was something called the Battle of Seattle. The World Trade Organization met in Seattle. They learned not to meet in large cities anymore. Now they meet in very small towns, so there aren't any demonstrations against them. But the Battle of Seattle was as much against, you know, international trade arrangements as it was against globalization per se, which was seen as a, you know, a big bad monster. Well, I would say that has not necessarily been the case. And, you know, countries like India, like China, like my own country, Chile, have made the most of globalization and have had much progress as a result of that. Now, what is interesting is, yes, you know, transnational Western companies have also made quite a bit of money out of it, but the effects on these countries has been mixed. In the United States, for example, where I live, vast swaths of the Midwest and of the South were essentially deindustrialized, as many factories were closed, and they moved to Asia, where workers are cheaper, where work can be more productive and more efficient. And thus you have something called the Rust Belt, you know. Vast amounts of, you know, part of the Midwest of the United States and the South, factories were closed, and workers who used to earn $30, $35 an hour union work suddenly are either on the dole or are now flipping burgers at McDonald's for 10 hours a day, an hour, so $10 an hour. Obviously, that doesn't go down very well. And so there's been a very strong reaction against globalization. And you had something similar in Britain, in the Midlands and in Northern England, where with many factories, something similar happened. Now, why do I say this? Because this is what created a tremendous backlash against globalization. In the United States, where I live, I've come across a new verb, to be Bangalored. Anybody here knows what to be Bangalored means? By which is meant somebody whose job is outsourced to Bangalore. Now, as you may have noted, many heads of state and government that visit India, they do Delhi, they do Mumbai, those are two musts, but many of them also do Bangalore, which embodies the new India, the Silicon Valley of India. There are more IT engineers in Bangalore than there are in Silicon Valley and California, which gives you an idea of which way the world is moving. I know this I studied at Stanford University, so I'm quite familiar with California. But the US president will never set foot in Bangalore. George Bush, when he came in 2006, he went to Hyderabad. He wouldn't be caught dead in Bangalore, you know. Barack Obama, when he came in 2010, he didn't go to Bangalore either. Donald Trump, when he came in 2020, didn't go to Bangalore. And I will venture to say then when President Biden comes, he is not going to go to Bangalore, you know, for that reason. Now, the interesting thing is, much as we can provide a date for the start of the current wave of globalization, 1980, CNN and the PC. You know, when I did my graduate studies at Stanford University, I wrote my papers on a typewriter. You know, believe it or not, those were the tools we used. Today, the company that made the typewriters I wrote my papers on, Smith Corona, no longer exists. It went bankrupt because it was replaced by the computers. Anyway, why do I mention that 2016 is the turning point and the end of globalization? And Dr. Singh already alluded to it. But let me add a little footnote to that. Throughout much of 2015 and 2016, following what was published in the mainstream press, international media, and also in the journals, the conventional wisdom was the following. The BRICS countries had their moment in the sun in the first decade of the new century. You know, somebody said that that was the decade of the BRICS, the decade without a name. The noughties were given the name by the BRICS because it was one of the few good things that happened. That decade was bookended by 9/11 at the beginning and by the financial crisis at the end. So it was not a very good decade, but one of the few good things that happened was the creation and the rise of the BRICS. Now, by 2015 and 2016, if you read Foreign Affairs, if you read the Financial Times, the New York Times, the conventional wisdom was they are fine, they had their moment, but now they are as passé as yesterday's baguette. The turn has come for serious countries, quote unquote, like the United States, like the United Kingdom, to take charge. They know how to handle global economic governance. They have experienced diplomats, unlike these parvenus from the global south, that are really just apprentices and are not quite sure how to handle these big issues of managing the world. Well, that was then. This is now. In June of 2016, the United Kingdom, in its infinite wisdom, voted to leave the European Union in what is known as Brexit. And the United Kingdom has spent the last years trying to, well, exit. One result is it's the worst performing economy in Europe today. The British economy is going down the drain, exactly for the reason that were predicted. By leaving the European Union, this is what was going to happen. And then, in November of that year, the United States elected President Trump as its president. And in a very short time, President Trump ditched the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It left, as has been referred to, the Paris Accords on climate change. It left the World Health Organization in the midst of the worst pandemic in a century. Think about that. In fact, at one point, and this is not something that has been remarked upon, at one point there was a serious possibility that the United States would leave the International Postal Union. Now, what would have happened with letters and packages going to the United States and from the United States to the rest of the world is anyone's guess. But there were serious conversations about the US leaving the International Postal Union. Now, think about sort of the sort of mindset that gets you to that point. If that is not deglobalization, I don't know what is. Now, my question is the following. Are these the countries the world should trust with running global economic governance? Under the circumstances, I would think the BRICS should at least be giving a fair shot at having a say in it as well. To entrust it solely to the hands of the likes of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson would seem to be a rather risky proposition. Now, the question is, how come, these so-called serious countries ended up electing leaders like Donald Trump, like Boris Johnson? Well, the reason is, and this goes back to Anindita's question, because they made the most of exploiting the fear and the distrust of the other, pushing nationalism to the limit, making political capital out of it. They rode to electoral victory denouncing immigrants and people of color, calling them rapists and drug smugglers, making references to taking our country back. Back from whom? Well, from black people. Taking back control from whom? Well, from immigrants. And yes, Trump was defeated in 2020, but he is now running for the Republican presidential nomination, miles ahead of his rivals. And there's at least, a good possibility that he might return to the White House. In the United States, being in a cell, being in a prison, is not an obstacle for running to the presidency. There are precedents for that. Eugene Debs, famously at the beginning of the 20th century, did so. Now, it's important to understand what this does to a country and to a society. Mass shootings, often hate crimes with strong racial connotation, are commonplace now in the United States, as often as one a day. And as recently as a week ago, in Jacksonville, Florida, a white young man killed 3 black people using an AR-15 emblazoned with swastikas and leaving a manifesto denouncing black people. Around the world, in Brazil, Poland, Hungary, Trump's example is being followed. So, which is my point? My point is the following. We badly need to overcome the strictures imposed on human behavior by narrow interpretation and application of the meaning of nationalism. This is necessary if we want to confront and deal with the major global challenges the world today faces, and which have been alluded here before. Climate change, pandemics, financial indebtedness, organized crime, mass migration, and so on, to mention only a few. Now, that is true, but what we are seeing now is exactly the opposite. In many countries around the world, political capital is being made out of denouncing the other, not embracing the other, of referring to climate change as a hoax. We saw this in the recent debate among Republican candidates for the presidency, you may recall. What happened to African refugees crossing the Mediterranean, of which 27,000 have died in the course of the past 10 years because the boats capsize. They will sometimes capsize, and there will be other ships around from navies, coast guards, and they will do nothing about it. I mean, you know what this means? I mean, it was brought to our attention, particularly when this private submarine with, I think, 4 or 5 people in it sank in the North Atlantic. And the whole world was looking at that. In the meantime, a ship with hundreds of African refugees sank in the Mediterranean, and nobody paid any attention. So this is the kind of world we are living in. The very factors that are threatening our survival on this planet are being weaponized to block action against them and describe as nothing but part of the so-called globalist conspiracy. So, I don't want to end on such a somber note. What is the way forward? Is there any hope at all? I think there is. What we have seen in the current century is the rise of an alternative to the great power competition that has been the hallmark of so many international systems in the past. And I refer to active non-alignment, an alternative that has emerged in Latin America in the past years, which takes a page from Indian foreign policy, that very dignified tradition of Indian foreign policy, and it's really come into its own. And active non-alignment may well take on a green hue, reflecting the urgent environmental priorities of a region especially vulnerable to climate change. Among the new and not so new crop of emerging Latin American leaders, such as Gustavo Petro in Colombia, Gabriel Boric in Chile, and critically, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil, the issue of global warming and how to lower carbon emissions is front and center, a matter in which differences between North and South as to who and how to pay for such programs remain unresolved. Environmental issues may also be an anchor for building new coalitions across the global South. And Brazil, with a strong record in entities such as IPSA and BRICS, may be called upon to play a leading role. In some ways, the COVID-19 pandemic, bad as it was a salutary warning about what happens when we mess with nature. The next big threat we face is, of course, climate change. Last year's floods in Pakistan, which affected 1/3 of the country, the recent wildfires in Maui, Hawaii, and in British Columbia, show that global warming is not somewhere in the distant future something that perhaps our children will suffer from. Climate change and global warming are here with us today. The world is burning, and we are not paying the attention to it that we should. It is with us, and unless we do something about it, it will consume us all. The threat, however, is also an opportunity. If taken sufficiently seriously, it may allow us to overcome the divisions that have plagued us until now. In this gap between nationalism and globalism, nothing less than the survival of the human species is at stake. If that doesn't act as a catalyst, nothing will. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was very enlightening. Particularly a different perspective from what we have on what happened, which strengthens the importance of globalization. I will now call upon Lalitha Kumaramangalam. I have already introduced her. You also want to stand?
Yes, sir. No, I don't need it. I'm fine, I can look over this. Good afternoon, everybody. Though I was introduced as being a member of the BJP, which I am, I'm not here as a politician. My friend Anindita said that I should try and make this women-centric, but I'm quite frankly tired of doing that wherever I go, so I will try and make it people-centric. To start off, let me say that I don't understand and I don't agree with this whole argument of one versus the other, globalism or nationalism. According to me, perhaps because I'm a woman and most women learn this the hard way, this famous word in India, adjustment. Why can't it be both? So what I'm going to say will more or less lead up to that at the end. Now, we live in a post-colonial and a post-World War II world, which means that we live with the reality or the threat, call it what you like, of the atom bomb, which has already been used, not once but twice. Also that we understand that we live under, and by we I mean India, I'm talking as an Indian. We live under the yoke of a globalism, which, as Dr. Karan Singh said, is more often than not today push down the throats of countries who may be called South, who may be called developing, who may be called less developed. These are all just terms and words used at the convenience often of people who hold more power in their hands than we do. To me, what is globalism? The fact that we should be able to trade. Most things are based on monetary compulsions ever since the monetary system has been introduced amongst human beings. And today, unfortunately, more and more politics. I may be a politician, but I know that politics can be as horrible as it can be good. Just yesterday, and I think today perhaps on social media, we are seeing these terrible visuals of a young woman being stripped in Rajasthan and then raped. What price globalism or nationalism? I mean, if women can still be treated worse than we treat our animals, and in India, even though I'm an animal lover, people really don't treat their animals very well on an average, then what is the price of globalism or nationalism? Basically, everybody is a human being. Yes, different countries have different cultures, different traditions, different languages, different food, all of that. But these are issues that are becoming more and more, for want of a better word, international. Most youngsters nowadays, I think, eat more pizza than dosa. Would like to listen more to, I don't know, today is not the day of rock. What is the music of today called by the youngsters? I'm not sure. But would far rather listen to rock rather than Indian music. Except perhaps some Bollywood songs. And anyway, more and more Bollywood, Tollywood, Collywood, what are they? I don't know what they sound like, Indian or West or whatever. So there is fusion that's going on. Globalization today, maybe when it started in 1990 or maybe even at the end of the World War II, was meant to, I suppose, at least I positively, if I want to look at it, promote goodwill between different countries. Coming out of World War II, I think the non-pessimistic people who wanted to look forward with some hope thought that whether it was then the UN, the United Nations, could become an instrument of unity, of amity. What has happened today is that we find that amity seems to be based on who has more power and who has less power. Jorge, is that how I pronounce your name? Say? Okay, I got it right, thank God. He mentioned Latin America. He's from that part of the world. I am from Asia, India specifically. And both of us do not have really very happy reactions to what is called globalization. Trade is necessary, yes. But I mean, really, globalization is also supposed to have meant an exchange of technology. I mean, how much has that really happened? India goes to the moon, which was an euphoric moment for almost every Indian. And what does our former colonial master, who's now somewhere way behind us economically, say? Oh, there are still so many poor people in India, why are they going to the moon? When the Ukraine war is stretching out, and many of us fear that it may well end up in World War III, which nobody wants, including the two people who are fighting that war, basically Russia and the US. Where is globalization then? As pointed out by an earlier speaker, Ukraine and Russia are not very much different. Their customs, their language, their food, their ancestry. What are they fighting over? Resources. Most people from the South, that is Asia, Latin America, Africa, will tell you that the North, so-called the leaders of those who are pushing for globalization, have stolen our resources, have not given us back really what we should have been given back. And to top all of that, still continue to treat us with such contempt. Now, as an Indian, I resent the fact that the British still think that they can talk down to us. For 200 years, they looted something like God knows how many 100 trillion rupees. And their entire prosperity was built on our resources. Nationalism, when it came first into India, I think Raja Ram Mohan Roy was the man who was supposed to have actually started nationalism when he started the movement for the anti-Sati movement. But that's history. And I don't think many people in this room want to look so much back into history. So nationalism is not always bad, and nor is globalism always bad. There are problems like the environment, which we cannot gainsay and we cannot and should not ignore. There are many other problems like nuclear. I don't know the number of countries now who are actually nuclear armed, apart from the main ones that we know of. Even Pakistan has nuclear arms. China definitely has. And maybe I'm going on a little tangent, but India is at loggerheads with both these countries, one way or the other. Maybe that holds us back from actually going hammer and tongs at each other. Maybe in that sense, globalization is good. At least in some ways it holds us back. But it hasn't held them back in Ukraine. The real fear of the Ukraine war is that we hope to God that no nuclear arms are used there. If that happens, then, well, we're done for. Everybody, not just Russia and Ukraine, everybody. And the apprehension that even people of experience, people of learning, like Dr. Karan, for example, have, is very apparent and very obvious, not perhaps so obviously, but very, very pervasive. And I think almost everybody in this room and outside, anybody who knows anything about international affairs. So today, the version of globalization of today, we talk of globalization from a very old perspective. Today's world has to be taken into account, where smaller, less developed, and these are all generic terms being used, they're not my terms, are becoming more and more aware that they have strengths that they would like to benefit, they would use to, put to their own benefit first. The recent comment made by some of the Western countries saying that India is responsible for the food inflation in the world because we've stopped exports of certain items. Where was this when we were buying tomatoes at 200 rupees a kilo? So, as an Indian, I would say that I elect a government to serve us first. Just as the Americans elect their government, or the English elect their government, the Germans or the Brazilians or anybody else. If that is bad for globalization, then perhaps globalization should also learn to adapt. Why, again, I ask this question, why can't nationalism and globalism or globalization coexist? There will have to be certain changes made on both sides. But sometimes I feel that it is the politicians of the world who prevent the natural order of things from taking place. You have white imperialism, you have white nationalism, you have Hindu imperialism, you have Hindu nationalism. I'm sure other countries have many other terms for this, using where nationalism is supposed to be part of it. Nationalism is not always bad. Yeah, who are the ones who practice it? Us human beings. And we are basically all flawed. All. Nobody is perfect. So perhaps it's in the practice of globalization, globalism, versus nationalism that we need to take some steps back, think about it, and say that yes, the larger good needs to also be brought into the picture. But then again, if you see from one country to another, the larger good itself differs. In India, when we talk freebies, parties come to power, regardless of which party it is. How is that wrong? How is that right? You know what a big debate there is. Similarly, if a country says that, look, I have to hold back on certain things because I find that people in my own country need the benefits from this more than I think the top countries in the UN need it, then do we call that right or wrong? It creates friction, yes, on a global level, perhaps country to country, not between all countries, but it also does solve problems within a particular country. Who's to come first? The global community of nations or a single nation? And then here the question arises that can everybody be on an equal footing when they do not have the same economic strength? Basically, today life is based, according to me, on two things: money and politics. Even if you put the politics aside, how do you put aside that the fact that economically countries throughout the world have such great disparities? Today, most of the world's resources are used by the US. Most of the world's environmental problems are caused by the US. I'm sorry to say it so bluntly. Everybody thinks that it is China and India, because we are the most populous nations, that we create more pollution. It's actually not true. Per capita, we are way behind the United States. But how is it presented? That the countries from the global south or the east or the developing nations, because of the sheer number of people they have, they pollute the world much more. I'm not saying we don't pollute. I come from Tamil Nadu, which is considered one of the best educated states in this country. You should just see our river, Adayar and Kuam. I mean, it stinks. We ourselves know it, but we can't say it. I'll probably be beaten up by somebody when I go back to Chennai, by the press at least, for having said this. Yes, of course we have things to handle in our own country. But we also can't afford to live in isolation. This is, again, the word globalized. It's an international community now. Somewhere, politicians must understand that power is very temporary. It comes, it goes. 150 years ago, Britain was the unchallenged power in the world. Today, the US still is. But things are changing. China is moving up very fast. China has its own brand of nationalism versus internationalism or globalization that many people criticize. It's not as if I don't think China is an enemy except politically and in our fight for the world's resources. But that happens between all countries. Countries within Asia fight with each other. Countries within Latin America or Africa. The problem in globalization comes when the more powerful expect that they can decide the politics of another country. Why were so many people driven out of North Africa? We talked about the people, the boat people as they are called, those who are running away from those countries. Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, of course, is Asia. There are so many countries. Because of the unrest that was really created by one of the biggest powers of the West. Where was globalization then? So if globalization is to be based only on power, what price globalization? Again, let me make it very clear. I'm not against the idea of countries trading with each other, with us sharing knowledge, especially in terms of IT, etc. But, and I quite understand that countries that have more economic might will want to, make sure that their writ runs more than that of others. But how long will that work? Is that a practical approach to what is coming? AI, for example. Most of AI technology is, again, I think, controlled by the United States. But if a country, and being Indian, I don't like saying this, if a country that's considered backward still in many ways, India can land on the moon and be the first one to land on the south side of the moon. I'm sure many of the computer geeks sitting in America are of Indian origin. Sooner or later, the technology is going to come to, you can't hold it back. In fact, AI is going to be of no use unless it is distributed around the world, much like computers. Today, Bangalore is the IT capital in the sense that it is the software people sitting in Bangalore and all the ones who work the various forms of social media, computers, etc., who dominate the space. So that whole term Bangaloread, is that it? Is that it?
Bangalore, to be Bangalore.
To be Bangalore has come. In a way, it's a compliment, though they don't mean it as a compliment. In a way, it is a compliment. So the changing structure, power structure of the world is what is causing this whole conversation, is really the reason behind this conversation, and asking people to choose. But again, I come back to my same old, ghisa peta thing, as they say in Hindi. Why should we have to choose? It's going to be impossible to turn the clock back on nationalism. Good, bad, indifferent. Let's be honest with each other about that. Whether it's India, whether it's Brazil, whether it's South Africa, whether it is some other country in Africa or anywhere else, or Asia. Think if the petrol-rich Middle Eastern countries can come on to BRICS. Nobody expected it. Nobody. Till about, I think, maybe a few years ago. At least nobody in the general public. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be surprised if many people from Brazil anyway is already from Latin America. Many people from many other countries. I think there are 15 countries waiting to join now. And eventually, I suppose they will. And the current, let's just take the COVID epidemic, the pandemic. Apart from the withholding of vaccines, really the fact that China was not condemned openly enough by the WHO, according to me, was a failure of that organization. Everybody knows the source of it and how it all came about. But till today, globalization or whatever it is seems to have prevented those who should have spoken out from speaking out. India has criticized, India meaning in this case more Mr. Modi, but like I said, let's leave the politics out of it. India is criticized by many people for having distributed vaccines for free. And many other countries, again it was more USA than others, is criticized for not wanting to sell their vaccines. Today, research has shown that many of the vaccines that were produced in the US have had very, very serious side effects. But again, nobody talks about that because, well, it came out of the United States. I'm not an enemy or a disapprover of the US. It's a fantastic country in many ways. The very fact that thousands of Indian students still go there and stay back and then do so well for themselves. I think we have at least about 35 CEOs of top companies who are all Indian, of Indian origin. That itself shows that it's a fantastic country. But again, it's not the country. It's the powers that be, the politicians, who just want to maybe stay in power or want to retain their economic and other advantage. That, I think, is creating problems between nationalism and globalism. Now, let me come back to women. I'm not going to just talk about India. Women in any war that takes place, nobody has really addressed the problems that the women of Ukraine have faced in this war. In any strife, today we still live in a hugely patriarchal world. It's something that nobody wants to talk about. Something that very few people acknowledge. People switch off when you start talking about this, and I've faced this for years. When I worked with the LGBT, sometimes Q communities, even I, who have worked with them since the late 1980s, just before the HIV/AIDS epidemic became such a big epidemic, I find it mind-boggling as to this plus, whatever it is. I find it extremely offensive when I'm told that a 10-year-old should, or a 12-year-old should have gender-blocking hormone injections. I don't even know what that means, quite frankly. These are agendas that are becoming more and more global. I find it very offensive. Not just because my culture doesn't want me to believe in it, but because I have seen the effect this sort of technology has on human beings. And I don't mean just their physical or their sexual growth. I mean as human beings. Youngsters today have far more stressful lives than I had. I had a father who, and Dr. Karan Singh will agree to that, who was possibly one of the most powerful men in the country when he was alive. I was 15 and a half when he died. I had no idea what politics was. I have heard my father call the late Indira Gandhi. I don't think any of them really called her that in private. She had a nickname. They all called her by that. My father's family was a very old, very illustrious, extraordinarily well-educated family. Also very liberal. Now, the advantage has, of course, been that I have never been held back, whether in studies, whether as a single mother and for the last 30 years, whether it was in control of my own money or getting my share of the property, etc. But that is still very, very, very rare in this country. And every day, even in a state like mine, Tamil Nadu, which is again supposed to be way ahead of states like Bihar and UP and Rajasthan, etc., when it comes to women's empowerment or education, we still hear of drunken men bashing up their wives. We still have a shroud of secrecy over domestic violence. And domestic violence is one thing that is so pervasive, nobody in this room will believe it. The biggest, best so-called, and again, biggest and best are in quotes, of families have domestic violence going on. Whether it's economic, whether it's physical, whether it's sexual. I mean, there are so many versions to it that even I sometimes, the mind boggles. When I was head of NCW, this was one of the things that we really found it difficult to get a grip of. Rape, etc., at least today, it is condemned universally. But violence, nobody wants to talk about. Nobody. The best of us want to avoid this extremely uncomfortable topic. Women, of course, they don't have, I mean, where will she go? During the COVID epidemic, many of us tried to set up safe spaces for women. But everybody was caught at home, and everybody doesn't live in 2 and 3 bedroom flats. They're much smaller than that. Where would the lady go to phone from? I'll say this in Hindi. I'm lucky enough to be able to speak it fluently. हाथ में मोबाइल फ़ोन तो था, पर कहाँ जाके खड़े होके बात करेंगी वो? जो बात करे वो तो सबको सुनाई देती है वो छोटे जगह में. We had a population explosion, I mean a boom, not population, a boom of births after the COVID epidemic. Not all of this is because men and women were in one place and they were having sex, but because women, I mean, like one woman put it to me, I won't put it as rawly as she put it, that she had no choice. She already had 2 children. When she got pregnant, where would she go? How would she get an abortion done without, everybody saying, hi, what are you doing? Even today, the responsibility for house, hearth and home is majorly on women. You can work. You can earn more than your husband. But it is you who's asked to adjust. Every young girl here is nodding her head, which means 3 generations after me, it's still true. What price globalization then? When the Triple Talaq law, the problem was brought to me, it was brought to me by a group of Muslim women. I have a very good friend who helped, whom we all worked together. So when it was brought to me, I spoke to the then MWCD minister and she said, Pagal ho? Main nahi isko lungi. So luckily, again, my family background came in useful. I went to meet Mr. K.K. Venugopal. He had worked with my father many years ago, and my father had worked with his father, so I knew him. I went and asked him, I said, what do I do? He asked me just one question. He said, do you want credit for this or do you want the job done? So I said, no, credit doesn't matter. Get the job done. So he told me, do not make it into a woman's rights issue. It will never go through Parliament. He said that to my face. Now, K.K. Venugopal is not known to be a bigot at all. He's one of the most reasonable, lucid lawyers in this country. So I said, what do I do? He said, make it into a constitutional issue. That's the only way you'll be able to persuade parliamentarians who know that it should be done and made into a law to actually vote for it. Ultimately, that's what happened. It took 3 years. He also said, do not send it to the MWCD ministry. Send it straight to the law ministry. It's a legal issue. So again, this was a local solution that had to be found, tailored to India. If I had chosen to take the international viewpoint on it, we would never have had the triple talaq, the ban on triple talaq law. Similarly, like this, many other issues. India is still, and many other African, Latin American countries, are still used as a sort of testing ground for vaccines, which is very unfair. There's that whole scandal around the HPV vaccine, the human papillovirus vaccine, which is true. There are many other vaccines which are still being touted. Fine, you will share the technology of the vaccine with us after it has been tested and proved okay and all that, but why are we the guinea pigs? So unless globalization also roots for at least a certain amount of equality or equity, both mean the same thing, just different words, globalization is bound to fail, regardless of how we package it or repackage it. Nationalism is now here to stay. Whether it's Russian, whether it's Indian, whether it's the American or Brazilian or from Jorge's country, Chilean, any, it is here to stay. But then globalization is also equally important in many ways. So I would say that instead of saying or instead of, could we please look at coexistence? Basically, human beings have to coexist. Language, culture, color, whatever, everything else notwithstanding, the world is a globalized world today. That's also not going to change. So perhaps we take some steps back and accept where we are also, where we also could, again that famous word, adjust, or come to terms that make it more comfortable, more easily acceptable to more. It will never be acceptable to everybody. Nothing is in today's world, but at least, and practical. Implementable, again, is a very important word. Just having it written in books and talking about it in such seminars and conferences is not enough. It has to be implementable. So my request is that, especially to all the youngsters here, that if you are convinced by even 20% of what I'm saying, look at it from that perspective. How do we make it work? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lalitha. You brought in a very important factor, the economic factor in globalization and the way the resources of the world are totally distorted. Now we have some time for discussion. What I suggest in discussion is anybody who wants to speak or ask a question could come up to the mic and say a few words, and not a long speech, just a remark or a question. So it's open house. Who wants to start? Youngsters. Utho. In the Second World War, Bangalore torpedo was famous for using it to cross minefields. Achha. Oh, there's a portable mic also, so you can that can be given to various people.
Yeah, actually, thank you very much for most enlightening morning and this post-coffee time. It's been really a learning experience. My question is, our new the National Education Policy of 2020 talks about fostering the concept of global citizenship in the children of the country. And this was a very important, I would say, landmark shift in the educational policy from the earlier documents. Now, how we implement this will actually depend a lot, because we have been talking about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam as the world as one family, one planet, one family, one future all the time. It's being repeated and it's happening so many times in a day. So how do you adapt and adjust to that? And then how will it through the educational curricula framework, instill this important quality of being a citizen of the entire planet rather than simply being an Indian. So to me, what is damaging is the militant nationalism and the polarization. So if we really educate our children in a manner to see the whole globe, not in terms of the binaries, but in terms of a larger whole, as like the way the cells of a human body or the flowers in a garden. There is diversity, each one is unique and makes a unique contribution, yet there is no conflict. The problem is conflict, clash, prejudice, narrow-mindedness. These are the barriers towards understanding that positive aspect of globalization. Thank you.
Who's next?
I
How about
have
from the younger people?
yeah.
Only after you, I'm not going to call to any of the other citizens.
My question is directed at Professor Heine. Thank you for offering some solutions and some answers to the ongoing crisis of globalization. As an educationist, I feel, Professor Heine, that international education has been largely a matter of tokenism. Would you agree that a more vigorous and expansive form of international education throughout the world will create the necessary awareness?
Let me answer that question. It seems to me what is important to understand is there are two factors at play here. One is a humanitarian reason, a moral argument, if you will. You know, we should be willing to help nations in need, countries that have problems, that have issues. That's one side. But the point is, it's not just that. I would argue it is very much in our own self-interest to do that, because otherwise things, well, will get out of hand. And we face global challenges that mean that they cannot be addressed just by one country or two or three. Unless we all cooperate, things will really go astray. And let me give you one very specific example. It is very far from the Indian experience, but it speaks to the challenges we face in the Americas today, and how this notion of nationalism, you know, my country first, no matter what, is leading us down the garden path. The poorest country in the Americas today is Haiti. Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the world, a country of 11 million people, in which 87% of the population live under the poverty line. 30% live in extreme poverty. 2/3 of the country are controlled by gangs. 2,000 people have been murdered by gangs in this first semester. And the international community does nothing. The Organization of American States does nothing. The United States does nothing. The CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean, does nothing. Now you could argue, well, why should we care? Let them stew in their own juice, some people say. Well, it doesn't work that way. Failed states have a way of becoming centers of organized crime, of drug smuggling, of all sorts of nefarious activity, of terrorism that impact the rest of the world. So I would say the argument for international civic mindedness that you mentioned is not just an argument, a moral argument. It is also very much, an argument based on self-interest. Unless we hang together, we will hang separately.
Thank you. This wasn't.
Yes, my basic question is to Jorge Heine, is that regarding we have seen the model, Bretton Woods that has failed miserably after in the last two decades, and we have seen that there is a US-led model which is leading to capital outflows and leading to a lot of inequality. Large corporations are rising massively. We are seeing, in fact, the Fortune 500, Microsoft, Apple having market caps which are larger than the GDP of many countries. And then there's the other model that is China-led with BRICS. We are finding that they are controlling the same the new climate change technologies, etc. And that is also leading to same exploitation of the minerals, etc. of lithium, cobalt, etc. which will be required for the climate change technologies. And that is also quite oppressive and quite a dominant model, and that is also going to be leading to a lot of inequality and as far as the global south and many of the emerging economies are concerned. So how do we bring cohesion as much as possible, because otherwise it will be an part of non-aligned movement, which also was not very successful, which was basically just led to the more dominance of European and the capitalist model, and the same pathway we are going to be following in the future. So how do we have? Thanks.
Yes, let me respond to that. What is very important to understand here, when we talk about what I call active non-alignment, is that we live in a very different world from that of the 50s and 60s, when non-alignment originated. That was the third world. The third world was poor. It didn't have much in terms of capital, in terms of trade, in terms of resources, and it engaged in, the French expression is diplomatie d'écaillère de doléances, which means victimhood diplomacy. You ask the North for transfers. That was what the new international economic order was all about. Not surprisingly, it didn't work, and the North did not pay up. Today, we live in a very different world. The global South is an economic powerhouse. The BRICS countries, even before the expansion, in PPP terms, have a bigger GDP than the G7. Now, of course, with the additional countries, much more. Today, we have what is known, instead of diplomatie d'écaillère de doléances, we have what is known as collective financial statecraft. You have the BRICS Bank in Shanghai, the new development bank, headed by President Dilma Rousseff, former Brazilian president. First CEO was an Indian banker. We have the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank. We have projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. You have in the South the sort of dynamism that was not the case 50 years ago. That, it seems to me, allows for the global South to take initiatives, to do things that were not possible in the past. Therefore, the global South countries do not depend to the same degree. They depend to some degree, but not to the same degree that they did in the past. And that opens, it seems to me, enormous possibilities. And I see in the BRICS great opportunities to move forward in that regard.
Thank you for the presentations. They really thought-provoking. I just had maybe a couple of observations shrouded in questions also. So one thing is that what right now the conversation is about is that there are global problems. There is globalization. There are companies which are multinational. We all enjoy their products as well. But of course there are issues of inequities in terms of power, which create problems in terms of who is going to access the resources, where is the lithium going to come from, and so on and so forth, right? So these are issues of global governance that we are talking about. And at some point, countries need or governments need to acknowledge that there are power inequities, and we have to come together and figure out a solution which works for everybody. So globalism it's basically acknowledging that that as a Earth, we are a family. I mean, we have been talking about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and all that, and a family which has deep inequities within itself, which needs to be accessed so that everybody can benefit from the process of globalism. That's what we have. The second thing is basically the nationalism idea. I think we need to think about borders as also administrative units, right? We can go to the John Lennon song about imagine the world as one country, but we know that practically, even if we think about world as one country, it's not going to be possible to actually govern it in that way. So it kind of, the balance between the nationalism and globalism is also about practicalities of how we address national concerns versus global concerns, acknowledging how they affect each other. So I would like to know your thoughts on that. And the second thing quickly, I have always heard about these arguments about US being the biggest polluter and why are you telling us what are we going to do? This kind of whataboutery doesn't really get us anywhere in terms of policy. Yes, of course, most of the pollution was done by developed countries before. Per capita, our pollution is very less because we are too many people around. You divide any number with the population, it is bound to be less, right? So per capita pollution is less, so is our per capita GDP very less. So there's no big surprise there. Now the question is, how do we address the third world countries who are trying to grow, have inherited this world which stands at the boundary of world climate change threat, which has been perpetuated by developed countries in the past, but we are also benefactors of it. We are using the technologies and ideas that have come out of it. So when we talk about global governance addressing climate change, we need to think about what the starting point is, and then think about how to address this problem as a global community, and not just kind of throw barbs at each other. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. Thank you.
You want to say something?
Yeah, with regard to the environmental thing, we also need to acknowledge that different countries are at different stages. If population is the problem in India, per capita consumption is the problem in the more developed countries. So there is no one solution fits all. And this is one of the first, acknowledgements every country has to make. Agreed that it has to be done on a global level, but it also has to be done on an individual level. That is what I'm trying to say, that even several global problems cannot be tackled just by a global initiative. Because most global initiatives are decided by not every country who sits at the table. People who live in Latin America, for example, will have very different issues with regard to environmental control or climate change than people who live, say, in Maldives or Seychelles or Andamans or many of the other countries who are from the global south. Sometimes I think just these terms itself make it much more divisive. Again, I said politics. Politics seems to be only about throwing accusations at each other. And we need a more equitable table where everybody can sit and talk. Nothing will ever be totally equal. That also all of us understand. But like Professor Jorge, Jorge? No. Jorge.
The last name is Heine.
Jorge Heine.
Professor Heine.
Okay, it's right. Professor Heine said, there are problems that are global, but each country should have the freedom to be able to tackle it to the extent it can and the way they're able to. Like I said, it has to work. We tend to talk too much about what should be done and ideally, but idealism doesn't always work. We must be more practical. Everybody. It's not just India or just America or just any other country. Everybody.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, were you going to speak?
Yes, sir.
All right. I thought you were just sitting on.
Please allow me to speak in Hindi because I
difficult.
feel comfortable.
Yes, yes.
मैम, मेरा प्रश्न ये है कि मानवता के सामने इस वक्त जो सबसे बड़ा जो क्वेश्चन है, जो क्राइसिस आने वाला है, वो है मूविंग बैक टू नेचर. We are moving away from nature. Mankind is moving away from constantly over the centuries, over the decades. They are moving away from the nature. What requires is back to nature, back to nature. And everybody is for it, but they are doing nothing for it. That is the point. हर कोई चाहता है कि मैं प्रकृति के पास वापस जाऊं, उसकी गोद में जाऊं, पर वो जा नहीं पा रहा, उससे दूर होता चला जा रहा है. उसके बीच में दो चीजें आ रही हैं. आपने भी कुछ बोला है, मैं उसी को उजागर करना चाहता हूँ. और ये मेरा बहुत प्यारा सब्जेक्ट है कि बैक टू नेचर. तो जो हमारे पूर्वज थे, जो आदिवासी थे, हम सब आदिवासियों की संतान है, चाहे हम कुछ भी हैं. हम वहाँ से चले थे, नेचर से चले थे, और कहाँ पहुँच गए. Thanks for the technology, it's taking us away, up in the space and all that. That's okay, fine. But why are we moving away from the nature? That is the point. That is the basic point. Question is, growing population. This is what I want to emphasize. Population बढ़ती चली जा रही है. इस पर कोई लगाम नहीं है. और मैं आपको विश्वास दिलाता हूँ कि पॉपुलेशन पर कोई लगाम नहीं लगाएगा. क्यों? कि जो मेजर जो एक्टर्स हैं, जो पॉपुलेशन को बढ़ा रहे हैं, यहाँ मैं नंगा होना चाहता हूँ. मैं पहली बार में नंगा होना चाहता हूँ. कोई भी दुनिया में इस सब्जेक्ट को नहीं उठा रहा, कोई भी स्कॉलर नहीं उठा रहा. क्यों नहीं उठा रहा मैं नहीं जानता, परंतु मैं उठा रहा हूँ. जो पॉपुलेशन को फैक्टर बढ़ा रहे हैं, उसके ऊपर किसी का भी बस नहीं है. रेस है उसमें, रिलीजन है उसमें. रिलीजन वाले चाहते हैं कि क्रिश्चियन बड़े हो जाए, मुस्लिम जो है वो 57 कंट्री हो जाए, जो हिंदू है अल्लाह का राज होगा, भगवान का राज होगा, क्राइस्ट का राज होगा. ये पॉपुलेशन को बढ़ा रहे हैं. दे आर द पीपल रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर इट. और फिर रेस आती है, रेस एंड रिलीजन. फिर देन कम जेनेटिक्स. कोई जेनेटिक के मैनियक्स हैं, they are after genetics. So all these factors are pushing the population up. और इस पर लगाम नहीं हो रही मैडम, लगाम नहीं हो रही और नहीं होने वाली. और यही पॉल्यूशन का कारण है. यही जो फायर है, अभी भी कनाडा जल रहा है. इस वक्त भी कनाडा जल रहा है. राइट नाउ. कनाडा कभी नहीं जला था, आज जल रहा है. और कोई एक सेमिनार में बोला था अगला साल इससे भी बदतर होगा. पॉपुलेशन बढ़ेगी, पॉल्यूशन बढ़ेगी, और ये विपदाएं आने वाली हैं, बहुत बड़ी बड़ी विपदाएं आने वाली इस संसार में. द रीजन इज पॉपुलेशन. और पॉपुलेशन को हम बढ़ाना चाहते, कम नहीं करना चाहते. इसमें रोल पॉलिटिशियंस का क्या? आपने पॉलिटिशियन को बार कहा है. इसके लिए जो पॉलिटिशियन, आई कॉल देम माफियास. इन लोगों ने दुनिया को कंट्रोल कर लिया और बेवकूफ बना के गलत रास्ते पर ले जा रहे हैं. हम गलत रास्ते पर जब नेचर से बाहर जाते हैं तो गलत रास्ते पर जाते हैं. इसके लिए रिस्पॉन्सिबल कौन है? द मैनेजर्स of the affair, and they are the politicians. They are managing everything, and we are electing them. और हमें बेवकूफ बना रहे हैं. They are conning us. See, so we are being self-conned people. तो sorry sir, I'm finishing. तो जब तक हम बड़ा सवाल ये है, जब तक हम पॉपुलेशन को टैकल नहीं करते, जो कि हम नहीं कर पाएंगे, ये भी मैं बताता हूँ, मेरा बस का नहीं है. पॉपुलेशन को हम लोग कंट्रोल नहीं कर सकते. मुसीबतें आने वाली हैं और भी आएंगी.
इसमें मैं कुछ कहना चाहता हूँ. ऐसा है कि कुछ वर्ष पहले, 50 वर्ष पहले, मैं मंत्री था हेल्थ एंड फैमिली प्लानिंग. फैमिली प्लानिंग उन दिनों में बड़ा महत्व रखता था. और फैमिली प्लानिंग के तहत हमने क्या किया, कैसे कम करें, हमने स्टेरिलाइजेशन की वो बनाई टारगेट कि मेन स्टेरिलाइजेशन, वुमेन स्टेरिलाइजेशन किया जाए. अब वो टारगेट्स जब बने तो दुर्भाग्य से ऐसी परिस्थिति हुई कि वो टारगेट्स किसी और ने बढ़ा दिए. तो उसी के कारण कांग्रेस पार्टी साफ हो गई 1977 में. नॉर्थ इंडिया में क्योंकि स्टेरिलाइजेशन की बात थी और संजय जो थे उनका प्रोग्राम था, उसने मेरे प्रोग्राम को लेके और स्वयं ही नंबर बढ़ा दिए. आई हैड वेरी मॉडेस्ट टारगेट्स, उन्हें बढ़ा दिए. नॉर्थ इंडिया के चीफ मिनिस्टर जो थे उसको खुश करने के लिए बढ़ा दिए. मैं लिखता रहा, मेरी चिट्ठियाँ हैं. आई एम गेटिंग रिपोर्ट्स ऑफ पॉसिबल स्टेरिलाइजेशन. आई एम गेटिंग रिपोर्ट. द लेटर्स आर ऑल देयर. व्हेन the Jain Commission, no, Jain Commission, not Jain Commission, Shah Commission. When it came, it looked into all of the things that they saw that. So, उसमें ये हुआ कि massive backlash, जो आप कहते कोशिश नहीं की, वो कोशिश करके हो गए. साहब मैं जीत गया अपना सीट. Oddly enough, मैं मंत्री था family planning. I won, everybody else lost. So what I'm saying is that controlling population, the birth rate is falling. एक बात बताओ, जो general birth rate है देश में वो गिर रहा है. We are gradually getting down to 2%. Even in the Muslims, the birth rate has fallen considerably over the last. अब जब census होगा तो पता लगेगा exact figure क्या है. तो एक तरीके से तो ये it will straighten out on its own. अब इसमें कोई drastic action कोई लेगा नहीं. आप ठीक कह रहे हैं, पर कठिन है. कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन है हमारी, हर एक को अपना अपना हक है. So if we do anything, it could be politically disastrous, it could be constitutionally infirm. So it is an important problem. But you raise two problems. One is population, the other is back to nature. अब नेचर ही हम तबाह करते जा रहे हैं तो बैक कहाँ जाएंगे नेचर को?
Okay.
सवाल ये है कि बैक टू नेचर, नेचर itself is now getting so attenuated, it's very difficult. But I agree with you. If we can reduce our consumption individually, if we can try and live individually a less flagrant life, a less sort of, expensive life, and try and control our own desires, that can help. Young people have got to do that. आजकल कोई दो बच्चों से ज़्यादा कहीं हो ही नहीं रहे. जापान में तो बच्चे चाहते ही नहीं हो, तो वो भी कम हो रहे. आज भी इंडिया में जो भी पढ़ा लिखा है, कोई दो बच्चों से ज़्यादा.
I was just going to say this. One of the most successful ways to curtail. हाँ ठीक है, एक मिनट सुनिए. One of the most successful ways to curtail population, it cannot happen overnight, is to educate your girls.
Yes.
99.9% of girls who have passed graduation do not want to have any number of children. They also have enough education to be able to access methods to reduce the number of children they are going to give birth to. Don't forget, sir, and I don't mean this as an insult to anybody, children are looked after by their mothers. We get pregnant, we have our babies, and then we look after them and bring them up. Mostly. It's changing, I agree. But the change is not strong enough for us to really say that men should be sterilized. What happened when... Okay, Karan, what he's talking about is when that forced sterilization drive on a lot of men happened, and it backfired very badly. But there is research that shows, there's enough data that shows that throughout the world, you educate your daughters, in a couple of generations, the birth rate will fall. In India, the birth rate is lowest in the south, where women are the most highly educated.
Right.
Highest in the states, where women are the least educated. So educate your daughters. ये मतलब 3 साल में नहीं होने वाला है, 30 साल लगेगा. But hopefully we'll be around for the next 30 years. By that time, if you really, and this applies to every country across the world, it's not just India. मैं इंडिया की बात कर रही हूँ, आंकड़े मेरे पास है. But it's there's been research done in Latin America, in Africa, etc., where when you educate your girls, the birth rate will fall.
That is absolutely true. We knew this half a century ago, and we stressed it, but we did not do it. But now women's education also, the percentage is growing higher. So I feel that as far as population is concerned, it is going to flatten out in about another 15 or 20 years by the thing. एक लियाना भी इनको देना जन साहब को. But you've made good points, and I wish you could go back to nature. मैं जाता हूँ कश्मीर, जाता रहता हूँ, वहाँ नेचर में भी बैठता हूँ. मैं समझ रहा.
Dr. Karan Singh, with your permission,
I just want to say something on nuclear weapons, which were discussed in the first 10, the second.
All right, yes, certainly.
It's a question of irrationality.
Nuclear weapons, yes.
Because I gave him a book, Third Millennium
Yes,
Equipoise,
I
which deals
remember
with it on a global basis. 5 top leaders of the world today can change the fate of the world if there were rationality. Dr. Ira Helfand, who's the leading scientist on nuclear weapons, I've worked with him for the last 20 years. He said 1 megaton weapon launched on a city in America, the temperature will go up to 100 million degrees centigrade. The sun is 6,000 degrees centigrade. The point I am making is, if you have 10 nuclear weapons, megaton weapons, and these are launched, there will be nuclear winter throughout the world, and there will be hundreds of millions of casualties over a couple of years. Because in the second year, even with a small exchange of weapons between India and Pakistan, the sun will not ripen in the corn belt of USA, tens of millions. So they are talking of more and more weapons when 10 are enough. The top 5 leaders of the world don't realize this. 10 weapons are enough, megaton weapons, to make sure millions of casualties over so many years.
I
It's
agree.
irrationality.
It's absolute lunacy to have nuclear proliferation. Nuclear proliferation is the most ridiculous thing. Because, as he said, but everybody wants more nuclear weapons. America is increasing its nuclear weapons. Russia is increasing its nuclear weapons. Even India is increasing its nuclear weapons. Pakistan, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense. You're quite right. If somebody from outer space was watching us, as they probably are, they see, kya log hai bane? I'm going to bring in something later about how the Anthropocene is over. But your point is very well taken. And any sort of global movement has got to involve a denuclearization, if that is possible,
Yes.
or some control over nuclear weapons. Otherwise, the lady wants to say something. Anindita, you want to say something?
Just very briefly.
It's on.
Very briefly, I just wanted to tell Lalitha that, well, I enjoyed very much many of the comments, but I just wanted to point out that this conference is not about choosing between nationalism and globalism, as you were pointing. Why can we not be both? Of course we have to be both. This conference is about how do we soften some of the hard boundaries so that the global organizations can be empowered, which it is not, at the moment it is dysfunctional in many ways. And I completely agree with Professor Heine that many times it is the nation state itself can be a rogue state. And for example, I just want to tell you I would refer to 2 persons. One is this Martin Luther King, who was referring to the Hitler's Germany and pointed out that what actually happened, that there was this national sovereignty and nobody was intervening when the Jews were so badly treated. So in that context, when Martin Luther King was fighting racism in USA, he said that you need to protest not to obey the laws. And then he pointed out that never forget what Hitler was doing in Germany was absolutely legal, although it was morally absolutely repugnant. So there has to be some organizations which can intervene when it is necessary. Elie Wiesel, if you remember, the Nobel Prize winner, he pointed out in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech that it is so important that we don't say whatever goes on within the boundaries of a given nation state, if it is wrong, we know when it is wrong and we should intervene. Even if that is not the idea of sovereignty, you don't mess with the internal affairs of a state. This is itself is a questionable principle.
कहाँ गया वो लड़का जी? देखो.
There's a lady there who's been waiting for a long
I
time.
know.
It's very ironical because today China is giving $1,000 to their citizens to increase their population.
Yeah, but they won't adopt from anywhere else.
It may not work.
Yeah, it's not
Now,
working.
what I want to
Exactly.
say is
He's
that
right.
the more we are talking of nationalism and globalism, I think multilateralism is not working as well, because we are doing bilateral discussions with countries depending on the trade agreements that we have had. So people are willing to give up their nationalistic tendencies and go with countries which can be of advantage to them. For instance, Chile, Peru can give us more of the titaniums and the other products which we like, which we want bitterly now. And so they are willing to do that with us, and we are willing to share some of our own resources with them. But somewhere, as someone said, that the European and the Western countries were not happy when we stopped our grains exported, and they were suffering some lacuna in that. So I think we are going to work more bilaterally in nationalism and globalism, not multilaterally. It's not going to work with both.
Yes, would you like to say something?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, let me put it this way. It is important to understand here, this is not, it seems to me, a question of feelings or a question of morality. The way I see it is a question of making this work. Now, so we have this world in which we have, billions of goods that are crossing borders. We have millions of people crossing borders. We have services crossing borders. We have culture crossing borders. And what has happened is that the rules and regulations and the institutions that deal with this are not up to speed. It's like traffic. If you have, a city like Delhi, imagine a city like without red lights, without police, and everybody gets on his car or her car and starts driving around. Well, it will be chaos. This is what is happening in today's world. I mean, you have something like the World Trade Organization, which was set up to liberalize trade and deal with trade disputes. It's paralyzed. It's basically stopped to work. Why? This is very interesting. Why is it not working? It is not working because countries in the north have decided that they don't want it to work. Because the WTO made some decisions. They have an appellate body. And countries brought cases to them. And this appellate body decided some cases against some of the northern countries. So they said, we don't want this. And the most extraordinary thing is now you have northern countries speaking. They used to talk about free trade. You know the term they use now? Fair trade. What does that mean? Can you tell me what fair trade means? And to have the United States talk about fair trade.
Exactly.
I mean, this is an extraordinary situation. So my point is, this is not working, and we need to fix it.
Actually, what's happening with, particularly with the Ukraine war, the munition manufacturers in the United States are making billions and billions every day. वो तो चाहते हैं लड़ाई चलती रहे, जब तक चलती रहे, the more longer the war lasts, the more profit they will make. Now, as long as you have these things revolving around every day, you say you're giving new arms to Ukraine. All these arms may be free to Ukraine, but they're not free to the United States government. They pay the manufacturing companies. So, what sort of a world are we living in which, on the one hand, we want to prevent wars, but then when wars happen, there's a certain small group which flourishes. I mean, this is
Bernard Shaw's
Arms and Men, and Eisenhower, of all people, warned when he left the presidency of the military-industrial complex. He said, be careful. There's a military-industrial complex all over the world. There's one in India.
There is.
In India also, we are buying, as somebody said, that we've become one of the largest importers of armaments. And we still have millions of children who go to bed hungry. So there is a mismatch even in our own country. And therefore, until as a point that Lalitha made, until some kind of an equity at least is introduced, then all this talk about globalization is really meaningless. And therefore, I think it brings us back to the fact that we've got to really rethink our whole situation, and that's what one of these seminars are for, to help us rethink. So now,
just one question.
yes.
The lady's been waiting for a long time.
There's a lady here who's been trying to get. Wait, all right, I'll get back to you. Lunch, खाना तैयार है ना भाई? देखो पूछा. नहीं.
Despite the threat of khana.
कोई जल्दी नहीं है, आराम से क्यों
No, I wasn't sure I should come in at this stage because so much conversation has already happened on different matters. But since you brought in the issue of mismatch, equity, and earlier this idea that we need to think in terms of the coexistence of nationalism and globalism, I thought I should sort of seek comment on two things. First, I think that there is a missing concept which, for want of a better word, I would say local or localism, whatever we like to say, because then we can think in terms of a triadic relationship, because the same kind of soft boundary and hard boundary can happen in terms of how do we preserve that diversity within a given unit, which the chair mentioned. You talk about Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia and so on. We know that these are not fixed categories. The nation is not a fixed category. So we need to think in terms of bringing into a conversation actually the local or the multiple within the nation, and then the world beyond. And I think if we can think in terms of diversity within, we can also think in terms of the possibility of that we can have soft and mediated borders with the global. My second element that I want to talk about really is that and since Professor Heinz mentioned it so many times, that perhaps it's a good thing to begin with self-interest. What is in national interest? It is in the urgent interest of humanity to talk about coming together, to deal with issues like global warming and climate change and things like this. But I think if we are focused only on practical concerns, which bring us together, then we are not going to be very successful at it. I think we may need really, in addition to that, a conversation about what we owe each other. Surely we may think in terms of owing much more to people who are immediately around us, whether it's family, community, nation, but also to people who are distant and far away. So I think we may need to bring into our conversation even that particular element of what would that notion of justice really imply, where we can accommodate that which is immediate and that which is a little distant from us.
Thank you. Now, last intervention by this young lady here. I mean, last before lunch.
I'm sorry, I'm standing between the lunch.
No hurry.
So I come in with a perspective because I work on global governance systems, and especially in smaller states. And I feel that when we talk of nationalism, globalism, and especially if I pick up South Asia as a region, and I'm looking at countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, one needs to understand how they play, how they understand, and how they use nationalism. Especially, for example, Nepal, which is a geostrategic state, where both India, China, and US and EU have large interest at stake. They look at, for the economic development, support from global powers. And moment the global powers come in, they invest, they pull back or they slow down, and they often blame it on nationalism. At the same time, Nepal, when it comes under too much of geopolitical pressures from all sides, they do genuinely push back with nationalism card. So there is that push and pull, which is, I don't say there is something bad with it, but I think when we debate on these issues, we need to decipher between what the requirements of a smaller state versus a global state are.
Thank you. All right, friends, we'll break now. Now you've got exactly 1 hour, which is much more than is needed for lunch. Wait a minute, is it 2 or 2:30 we're meeting again?
I don't have a watch. So my phone is in my bag.
We go back, come back at 2:30 sharp. 2:30 sharp.